Star Wars is a multi-billion-dollar company, and with that, it's safe to say that they could afford top-notch content and storytelling. And when Star Wars was bought by Disney, our expectations peaked, but then seemingly overnight, so much of what we loved and wanted to see just vanished, and was deemed Legends or EU/the Expanded Universe. Some of the things that were retconned or cancelled were Mara Jade, the game 1313, the Yuuzhan Vong War, Countless Jedi, and George's idea of the sequels. But then, when all hope seemed lost, Disney announced Movie 7, The Force Awakens. And judging by how many views it got, and the fans were hyped. But amidst all that hyped, there were some people who were very skeptical of the movie, but they were just written off as overly cautious. And then the movie came out, and it really just seemed like a copy of A New Hope. But then it only got worse. The next two movies of the trilogy surpassed our lowest expectations and completely ruined so many of our beloved characters, and introduced new characters that were not nearly as good as the OGs in my opinion. But hey, maybe I should do a video about my thoughts on the sequels. But what did the original sequel trilogy look like, and how is it so much more different from the one we got? There's also two different ideas of what the original sequels would have looked like, and I will be covering both of them. And now, let's begin. Politics may be something that very few people like in real life and in Star Wars, and unlike in the sequels that left us with so many questions about the New Republic and how the First Order somehow just rose to power, George had a different idea on how his sequels would have played out. His sequels would have told us the story of chaos, lawlessness, and a power vacuum that was created when the Empire was destroyed, and how the Republic tries to fill that void in. And just like what we saw with The Mandalorian, there would still be Imperial Remnant that was filled with stormtroopers and officers that refused to give up on the Empire and fight back against the rebels. And as well as the Empire fighting to regain power, the criminal underworld would also see an opportunity to rise to power. And amidst all the chaos in the Imperial Remnant and the criminal underworld, one person would see this opportunity and take charge, and would be none other than Darth Maul. Now this obviously would mean that some of it, if not all the rebels, would have never happened. Now at this point, Darth Maul would be very old but still able to fight. And we did see at the end of the Clone Wars and during the Empire, Maul already had his own criminal empire known as the Crimson Dawn, and the main conflict would have been between him and his criminal empire against the New Republic and Luke's Jedi Order. And as shocking as it is, George would actually take a few pages from Disney's book and retcon some of his own work. For example, Maul's new apprentice, Darth Talon, is not actually something he created for the sequels, but originally was from a Dark Horse comic that takes place 100 years after the originals. And George Lucas envisioned her as somewhat as a new Darth Vader, and would have done most of the fighting because, as I've mentioned, Darth Maul at this point would have been very old. Darth Talon would also have seduced Han and Leia's son Skylar to the dark side of the Force. This all would have happened in Episode 7. Now let's switch our view to Luke Skywalker. George's idea is still somewhat the same in Disney's, is where Luke is rebuilding the Jedi Order, and would have taken a new apprentice called Terran, and this character would have been the foundation for Disney's main character, Rey. And similar to Disney, Luke would go into exile after he failed to protect his students and they all died. But unlike Disney, this would have happened on screen where we get to see Luke's fall from grace. And another similarity is that Luke would train Terran and form a teacher and student-like bond with each other, and eventually rejoin the fight to right his wrongs. But what about the other Skywalker? In this sequel, the main focus would be on Leia and about her and her struggles to rebuild the Republic, and the looming threat of Maul, and then making sure there's no corruption similar to how Palpatine rose to power. But the threat of Maul would only be solidified when he finally groups the remaining Imperial Remnant and his gangsters and starts his attack in the New Republic. And just like in episodes 4 and 7, Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewie would team up to fight the threat. And like in episode 7, Han and Leia would drift apart and Han would actually meet his fate at the hands of his son. We'd also finally get to see the Whills in live action. And for those of you who don't know, the original name of Star Wars was called The Adventures of Starkiller, as taken from the Journal of the Whills. And the story was going to be told from their point of view. Eventually though, they would be changed into the Force, but the sequels would have expanded on them and tied them in with the midichlorians. And similar to Disney, Luke would most likely die, but not before rebuilding the Jedi Order. And the trilogy would have ended with the death of Maul and Leia finally rebuilding the Republic, this time free of corruption, and would have turned out to be the true chosen one by bringing balance to the Force. The other version of the sequel that George had was different in some ways than that I just mentioned, but also bared a lot of resemblance as well. But I won't be going into as much detail because there's a lot of similarities and I don't want to make a 30-minute video. This version of the sequels would have centered around the two grandchildren of Luke and Han called Sam and Qi'ra. And like their grandparents, Sam is skilled with a blaster and a smuggler, while Qi'ra, from what we know, it was Force sensitive. The three movies in this trilogy would have been centered around the two kids and Luke. It should also be stated that Qi'ra would have been the main character of the sequels. But unlike Rey, and would actually have character development, Qi'ra would have also started out like Rey as a scavenger, while Sam would have been a smuggler just like his father and a marine expert. And the two of them would go on a venture to find out about the past. And like the previous versions, Luke would be in exile on a Jedi temple. There would be two main plots of the version. One of them would have been the search for Darth Vader's remains in order to find Luke. It would have actually had them search searching the underwater wreckage of the Death Star for information. And while searching the throne room, Kira would find a map to the Jedi Temple where Luke is hidden. We actually know very little about what happens to Han and Leia in this trilogy, but we do know that Han would die. And the main antagonist of the sequels would have been Darth Talon like the previous version. Talon's role in the movie was to right the wrongs of Maul. She would also play a massive role in the destruction of Luke's Jedi Order, but unlike the other versions, she would not have a master, but rather would be very skilled in the dark side and in the underworld. And as a side note, R2-D2 and C-3PO would be separated. And very similar to the other versions, Lucas would have a major part of the sequels focused on the Wills. In this version, Luke would have trained Leia and would have actually died by a group of people known as the Jedi Killer that turned on him who worked for Darth Talon. And the finale would have been about Kira and Sam killing both of them, and the rest of this version was still under heavy development when it was sold to Disney, so we actually don't know what happens afterwards. I gotta say that both of these versions sound very interesting, and I found it shocking that so much of the original trilogy. What are your thoughts on this? Do you prefer Disney sequels or the original sequels? Let me know in the comments. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you do, make sure to like and subscribe, and with that, my fellow Star Wars nerds, may the Force be with you.